And yeah, and let's see how that goes. Hi, everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit about identity and just, I think, broadly the question, who am I? A little bit about what identity crisis looks like, what does that happen, and especially, I think, the phase of adolescence, right? Like, what does, how do we figure out our identities? How do we figure out the answer to the biggest question that all of us face, which is, who am I? And sort of figuring that out, I'm hoping to hear a lot from all of you, try to understand what all of you think about this, and how do you define yourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the psych theory of it before we get into the questions and the everyday nature of identity. So one of the most famous identity theories that's usually quoted is Erik Erikson, and he usually talks about identity and development in every person through psychosocial development and stages of psychosocial development. So Erik Erikson broadly explains all of life through various stages where you have a particular kind of dilemma or a particular kind of challenge. Like an infant, for example, needs to first trust the world before being able to do anything else. And the biggest psychosocial challenge, according to Erikson himself, would be finding an identity, which usually would occur at the time of adolescence, where we really cement our idea of an identity. So Marcia was the person who sort of went ahead with this idea of identity and try to break that down into different ways in which we resolve this concept of identity for ourselves. So, according to Marcia, some of the ways in which people do it is that either they conform to society's standards, which is also known as a moratorium. So, either they conform to society's standards and how the society wants them to be as an identity, which is super common in South Asian cultures and contexts, that you never really have the opportunity to figure out who you are by yourself, but you're usually told by your family or your culture that these are the ways in which you should behave, or this is the way that you should live out life. And then there are the much more complex ways of negotiating our identity, where we're constantly trying to explore and trying to understand who we are through different ways and trying to piece together what that looks like for us. So I guess if we broadly look at how do any of us answer this question for ourselves, that's partially, I think, either through maybe values or traits. What do you guys think? Is that something you agree with? So values or traits perhaps is one response to it. For some, it's perhaps the biggest experiences that they've had in their lives. So experiences or challenges, and those are the things through which they define their identity, that I lived through this, or this is what I did, and this is what defines me more than anything else. For some people, it's some core trait that they think is unchangeable within them. And they believe that that is something that they can hold on to even in the absence of everything else. So that perhaps is truly what defines them. And and I think for some others, it's perhaps an acceptance of the transitive nature of their identity as well, right? That these are the things that will help me achieve or be who I need to be right now, but this will probably change, and I've made my peace with that, or I'm okay with that. So I think there are different ways through which all of us resolve these dilemmas for ourselves. I think it's a huge challenge for adolescents, especially, to reach these sorts of conclusions at a time which is already filled with so much turmoil. There's so much happening at that time, whether it's all the things that are happening with their education. They're moving on to a new phase in their lives, learning to understand their own gender and sexuality. They are figuring out relationships for the first time, and all of these things, they can only figure all of that out in a sufficient manner or in a concrete manner, if they figure out who they are first or who they want to be, what does that look like? So, yeah, I guess I'm also curious to hear from all of you that what does that mean for you, and how do you define that for yourself? Um, so, if any of you have any responses to that, what does your identity look like for you, and are you happy with your identity? Are you content with how you've defined your identity for yourself? So we're already getting a question from Ash Tosh, where someone's asked us that can we mold our identities as per society, or we need to accept who we are? And yeah, that's broadly the dilemma that Marcia also talked about. That that I think there's a huge pressure to conform to the way that society understands our identity or believes that this is how we should live out life. Um, but I think there are huge internal forces also within us, right, which are constantly defining us or telling us more about ourselves. And a sense of inauthenticity if we don't listen to that voice, and the difficulty in, I think, continuing with society or figuring out how we can continue to live with society if we're only listening to society's voice and we're not listening to ourselves. But that being said, I think all of this obviously sounds really simple in theory, but it's a huge struggle to really say out loud who we are to the world. I was talking to someone about this recently, that when we talk about this in the context of gender and sexuality, um, there's um, there's a belief that uh, it'll be so hard to come out, and it's a very difficult experience for each person to do that. But on a really general level, and this is not to be reductive, of course, of the experience of coming out, which is really hard and really difficult and filled with so much stigma in so many places, but it's always difficult to just announce to the world who we are. And that's something that I guess in some ways is complex for each person. That once we figure out who we are, I guess the next big challenge becomes letting people know who we are and defining that in front of other people. So that, I guess, also becomes really, really complex and really hard. And I think we're also scared of so much judgment, right? When we do something like that, what will other people think? How will other people think of me? Should I choose my traits and my values based on what will be best accepted? Or should I listen to this inner voice, which perhaps offers me some traits of some rewards of authenticity or genuineness or some inner gratification when I live by my inner truth? But it's definitely really, really hard to even begin to think how we make those choices for ourselves, and extremely complicated to do that. Um, yeah, and I think our users are also letting us know that it's really hard to do this in society, and it often feels like there's no one who's really compassionate and listening to us. That we feel like we're not being treated well, and even though we're trying to live out our best lives. But I think, yeah, to all those people, I want to empathize, and I hope people do listen to you eventually. But until then, there is a huge reward in just being free, being open about who we are and how we live our lives. And I'm certain that that will happen eventually. When you keep living out your truth, people recognize that eventually. I do truly believe that as a person. That, and I think the world becomes a much more interesting, a much more beautiful place when we are all courageous enough and brave enough to show our inner truth and share our inner truth, despite the fact that it's super hard to just go against society sometimes and still live out this life. So, but despite that, we need to keep living out the things that we believe are true. And we have another question here where someone's asking us that do people influence our identity? And I think that definitely is super true, right? In any sort of circumstance, that the people we respect, the people we want to be like, the people we want to love, all of those things define our identity in certain ways. I think that changes depending on, of course, what age you're at, what kind of a position that person holds in your life. Like, who hasn't been influenced by their parents, for example, right? That's like the most obvious example out there. But apart from that, of course, like our significant others, our partners, how have they influenced our identity? But it doesn't quite happen in the way that if you admire a trait in another person, you develop that trait. But we definitely, it forces us to also introspect on ourselves. Like, I feel like I didn't know so many things about myself until the persons I loved or the persons who were in my life made me either confront it or think more about it or question it. And and there were certain parts of me that I then wanted to change or think more about, or uh, or yeah, or even appreciate more, right? Like, get validated on the certain parts of us that make us feel good, that make other people also feel closer to us. So I think that change is constant, and the people around us are such a huge part of it. So that's definitely for sure. Yeah. And yeah, and we're getting a lot of really interesting comments here. So I'm just going to quickly share some of that with all of you. There's one of our users has shared with us that there's someone who has been working on a startup, and after all the pivots and after all the changes, it's been very, very difficult for them to feel connected to their identity, and there's been a severe identity crisis that they feel they're both experiencing right now. Thanks so much, firstly, for thinking that and trusting our platform with that, for sharing it here. And I think, firstly, I think it's so courageous that that you've made these choices with your co-founder, that you kept taking these steps to try something new. And I think it's really important that the courage that you had in starting this, that's something that you hold on to, even though things aren't working out right now. Because I can't think of anything, more amazing than just, I think, just in this tiny anecdote, I think something that you shared with us is so much determination and so much resilience that it must have taken to even just do those three pivots that you've talked about. And it's going to take a little more determination and a little more resilience. But if you had to make a choice right now about your own identity and what you want to keep in your identity, that determination might be a really cool thing to take away from this. And again, I think I realized that these things are so easily said, and it's going to take time. It's going to take so much effort for you to do that. But I really hope that you do, and you keep sticking through with things that you love. It may not take the form that you expected, and it may not be in the form that you initially envisioned it or imagined it. But trust yourself. You've started something that you probably cared about and probably um, had a great vision for, and it's going to turn into something meaningful. So, yeah, so I just wanted to give a quick shout out to one of our viewers who shared this. Um, but yeah, but quickly coming back to what we were also talking about with identity, um, I think it's interesting, that I think most cultures end up defining identity primarily through work or employment, especially once we've grown up. So if you go to a new person and you ask them that, like, what do you tell me about yourself, or who are you? And it's strange that most often most people will start with what they do for a living. So yeah, and I know I do that a lot. So it's one of the quickest ways for me to introduce myself. So yeah, so I'll just be like, I'm a mental health professional. Or and yeah, I know, similar things for people around me. They'll be like, I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor. But yeah, I guess it's funny because if you think about it, that of course isn't the only thing that defines us. And it's often also not the biggest thing that defines us, right? There are so many things that are a part of us. And there are so many things that can be much more important than our occupational identity. Yeah, so many things. So yeah, I guess I'm also wondering that how do we prioritize other parts of our identity and also take into consideration more parts of us than the part that is most visible to the world outside of us. I think, especially for minority identities, being queer or being of a particular religion, or uh, or being from a particular country, all of those things end up taking priority in the way that people start introducing us in social circles. That, oh, this person is, like, they're Muslim, or that they're queer, or that they're from Vietnam. But those, of course, aren't firstly the only identities that define us, even if they are really important parts of us. But beyond that, like, there are so many other aspects to us, right? So I guess I'm wondering that when people are constantly defining us through these terms and words, then are we also sticking to these definitions, or is there more that we are defining for ourselves? How are we defining ourselves in the midst of all of this? um, there's a particular viewer who's asked us this once or twice now, that they came out as trans to their partner, and that was not very well received. And now they're scared to come out to their family. And yeah, I wish I had a fuller answer for you right now, because I can only imagine how complex this process must be for you. And I really, really wish and hope that you found people who are also supporting you and trying to make this transition easy as you're coming out to more people. And I think it's definitely going to be a complex coming out to anyone, because so many people misunderstand what being trans means, or don't fully understand why that's happening now. And I think that explanation might take time for people to fully understand. But maybe if you think it's a good idea, it might be a good idea to start with someone who you think may understand you a little bit better in the family first before you come out to your whole family. So that might be a starting step. Or yeah, I think an easier way can also be just taking them to either some meetings, or a pride march, or something that also introduces them to the community, or introduces them to what such people, such communities, such spaces can be like. And that sometimes eases out the idea of what it means to be trans. So that perhaps could be another thing that you could explore as a possibility. And yeah, I am sending you a lot of love and light. And I really hope that the coming out goes as well as you hope. And you keep trusting yourself, and just keep loving yourself for your inner truth, and stick with that. And eventually people will come around, and they will understand who you want to be, and how you best feel and fit in this world. How do you see that for yourself? So yeah, I think it takes everyone some time to understand that sometimes. But yeah, but I really hope that it goes well for you. And yeah, there's so much conversation that's happening today. So it's a little hard for me to keep track of all the questions that are coming in. So I'm just gonna quickly go through some and answer some of them. So so there's also there are, of course, a couple of people who are also talking to us today about depression and anxiety. experiencing that, and how do they make sense of their identity with that. I think that's a great topic to pick up, because I think mental health concerns often also become just like other minority identities that we spoke of, right? That like people start identifying you, or you perhaps also start identifying yourself as someone who is depressed or anxious, or I have mental health concerns, or but A, is that the only thing that you are? What are the other things that you are? How else would you want to define yourself? And and also, how do you make peace with this part of your identity? That yes, perhaps these are things that I struggle with. The struggle is very, very real, but this is not all of me, and this is not the only thing that I'm dealing with. There's so much more to me. So I used to love this example, especially with children with developmental concerns. So when we were being trained in our professional training, um, we were often taught that you say a child with autism as opposed to an autistic child, and the logic for that was often that uh, when you keep saying an autistic child, even as a mental health professional, you end up thinking that that's the only thing that they are, and you only need to think about their symptomatology, or you only need to think about their symptoms, or their concerns as an autistic child. But what about the other parts of them just being kids? Like they can be really naughty kids, or they can be really sarcastic, or they can be really funny, or they can be super creative. That do we acknowledge all these parts of kids apart from perhaps some specific concerns that they may have? Is that the only thing that we're thinking about? And I think that's a super valid question, right? When it comes to mental health concerns, that these aspects of our identity that everybody's focusing on overshadows other things so much that we also start doing that with ourselves. And it's a good idea to rethink that. So it might be a great idea actually, that if you feel like these thoughts are resonating with you, I think it's always a great idea to sit every couple of years and just answer this question again for ourselves. That if you had to write the story of your life, what would that look like? Or if you had to talk about who you are as a person, what would that look like for you? And yeah, I think that's an amazing question to ask yourself every couple of years, because I think the answer always surprises us when we write it down. So yeah, okay, I'm gonna quickly answer a couple of other questions, and then maybe we should. Yeah, I'm hoping to also figure out how we should figure out a way to wrap this soon, because there's so many questions today. But yeah, okay. So one of the other questions is, can identity issues be genetic, or it's influence from environment? Okay, that's an interesting one. Um, I see creating an identity as a very, very social and contextual process. So it's usually something that's definitely more environmental. But I think similar to mental health concerns that I was talking about, or other aspects of our traits, I think there are certain aspects of our personality for sure that I think could be linked to genetics or something that's hardwired within us. Like I think every new mom will tell you that like this was my baby right from day one. So I think there's certainly certain things that are hardwired within us, but those are part of our personality. But identity is something that we form over time, or we decide for ourselves, whether it's in terms of our goals or aspirations, values, traits. It's a mix of all of those things. And also finally deciding the prioritization of that, which I think is a process that happens much later and is happening in context to a lot of things around you. So I definitely don't think we can call it something that's purely genetic. I think genetics may have a tiny or some role to play in it, but yeah, but I largely see it as something that's sociopolitical and contextual for sure. Yeah, and yeah, um, we're. It's interesting that yeah. Uh, okay, we're getting another wonderful question from someone who's saying that Aspies, especially persons who have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, are weak with social identities, but strong with abstract identities. So, how do you connect to people when you don't relate with the social identity for yourself? And okay, that's pretty interesting. I think how most persons with Asperger's have defined that for themselves is largely in terms of I think figuring out a how to communicate that abstract identity to others. B, I think figuring out, uh, yeah, I think explaining how their brains are wired just as much as trying to understand neurotypicals. So, a neuroatypical is just as fascinating a perspective, right, to understand any sort of social relationship. So, I think the question itself assumes that there is one kind of social identity or one kind of way of connecting with people. um, I don't think that there is an absence of a want to connect with a person, which I think persons with Asperger's syndrome also want to do, but it's usually really difficult to understand what the other person is thinking or what the other person is feeling, which sometimes makes it a little bit difficult to fully go through that social process, right? Or as the viewer has rightly said, that also assimilate ourselves as part of the social identity. But I think yeah, I think communicating how you are processing the world or how you are thinking and feeling is a great way to give someone a window into how you construct your identity and also how you would want to construct relationships around you. Because I think it's such an amazing lens into how you can see the world in different ways, which I think we take away from what we classify or club as mental health concerns, or something that we see as atypical. But yeah, but it's it's also such an amazing lens to understand the world from. So there's so much more that I think should be shared off that. Yeah, and there are some people here who are talking about their crisis in identity and how sometimes it's really hard for them to feel sure of who they are. And to all of them, I would want to say that that I think it's really difficult to, I guess, ever truly be fully certain of who we are. But I think one of the ways in which people resolve it is one of course, I mean, sticking to Marcia's theory, you can always just stick with the social identity, right? And just that's the quickest way in which people become sure of their identity. But I think the other way in which people feel certain about their identity is is to just start prioritizing the things that they find important in their life or they find important in who they are as people. So if that definition is something that works for them, then that becomes a quick way for them to understand what are the aspects of the identity that they would want to work on or they would want to spend more time on and figure that out. Because I think the internal drives, right, the things that you can't avoid about yourself, the things without which you feel empty or without which you feel like life is meaningless, uh, that inauthenticity, I think, is so strong when you avoid a particular part of your identity, that that's usually just like right there. But it's the smaller things, it's the smaller things that aren't really bothering us so much but we're not really sure about. And a good way to sort of figure that out for ourselves is to just figure out what prioritize priorities we like, or what are the things that we really care about. And that's a great place to start from and figure out what are the aspects of our identity that we're perhaps a little more sure about than other ones. And yeah, I think I see identity as a choice in so many ways. And and I'm not talking about, of course, the identities that we're born with here, and the aspects of our identity that are, of course, right there from the beginning. But I think traits or values or our goals, our aspirations. These are things that we keep choosing and we keep changing and we keep making more choices about it. And that's a process that's continuous, which I think is also what makes life really exciting. So, yeah, that's all that I have to share for today. Thanks, guys, for coming in. And I really enjoyed talking to you guys about a little bit of psych theory and also listening to all these amazing questions that you had to share. So, thanks so much for that. And I hope to see you guys soon. Bye. Good night.